Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning in, and oh, what a beautiful, joyous day it is today. Y'all, we have reached the end of Vision. We are on the final chapter for Vision. It's chapter 8, the midway point of our semester, so if you've made it this far, you've made it halfway through. We are talking about motion perception. We're going to be talking about this part of Vision. And then the remaining 7 chapters are going to be dedicated to our other senses. We got 3 chapters that are about hearing, a chapter about balance and orientation, a chapter about touch, a chapter about smell, and then a chapter about taste, in that order. And that I love teaching this class, but like those last 7 chapters are my favorite chapters because I love talking about the other senses, especially the ones that maybe we don't think as much about compared for Vision. All right. The other thing that I want to mention before we get started here, this chapter I think should take about an hour. I don't know why I keep saying that, trying to predict, because like you got the video link, you know exactly how long this video is, and you can plan accordingly. But I think we can make it through this in an hour. It's kind of a shorter chapter than some of the others, and it does have a little bit more technical jargon in it than some of the others. So I'm going to try to stick to the big applicable, like the things that you can apply to your everyday life. The other thing that I want to mention is just a quick kind of comment on Chapter 5. We were talking about color, and I was talking with my spouse about how I was just so fascinated by that notion that color doesn't exist in the real world. We talked about that, and she was like, well, technically it does exist because other species and other people can sense it too, so it's internal. And I was like, yes, that's right. And then we got, into this conversation about about how interesting that is, that we all agree on these experiences that we perceive internally, but that we don't actually have access to. You remember Plato's cave from chapter 1, so we're talking about this stuff. This isn't the only thing we talk about over dinner. It just happened to be for today. But she found that to be really kind of a lonely thing to think about. This idea that what you experience is experienced by you, but you can't be sure that the person next to you is experiencing the exact same thing. And she found that to be a little bit sad in some ways. And I just wanted to shout that out. That if anybody was feeling particularly depressed after chapter 5, apparently you weren't alone. Let's get into it. We're talking today about motion perception. We'll talk a little bit about how movies work, which is through this mechanism called apparent motion. And then we'll be talking about how visual motion is computed in the brain. We'll talk about how that's related to eye movements. And then we'll kind of wrap up by talking about how vision is connected to some of our other senses and some of those interactions, which we're also going to be touching on throughout the semester, because when we talk about hearing, we're going to be talking about how hearing can change based on what we are looking at, or how our sense of motion, like physical motion of moving back and forward, can change based on what we are looking at. So it's kind of a way of introducing those other senses. So I got a few videos. Actually, I have quite a bit of videos in this PowerPoint. Most of them I'm going to be showing you, though, and walking you through them. But the one out of these, out of the video for the day, if I had time, I would show all of these to you. And I've already shown you the motion after effect one. That was on the first day of classes, or the first video that I sent out to you. But I am going to be talking about the mask illusion. The motion smoothing thing is really interesting. We can talk about it on Plato, though, in the discussion forum. But I want to walk through the mask rotation illusion with you because I think it's just so dang fascinating. Here we go, and I will kick the subtitles on for this.
This is the hollow head. Actually, at the moment, it's a perfectly normal head of Charlie Chaplin, but wait, as it comes round, you'll see, or will you, that it's hollow. The back of it, coming around now, is actually a hollow mask. It appears to rotate in the opposite direction, and amazingly, the nose sticks out, although it's actually sticking in. Coming round now is the normal, correct, as it were, face, and wait again as it comes round, and you'll see.
Okay, I'm just going to pause it right there. Just in case you didn't catch that the first time, what happens is we have this mask. It's a hollow, just a regular plastic mask of Charlie Chaplin, and it is rotating clockwise. Now, think about what direction it is rotating. Here, I'm going to put this on silent. Sorry, British guy. So here it is moving clockwise, right? So you see it moving, you know, from right to left like that. But as soon as it turns around, many of you are not going to see it as still rotating clockwise. Now it looks like a kind of a silly putty color face moving in the opposite direction, but now that we see his actual face, we now feel like it is moving clockwise. So as this moves, it's moving clockwise, and then in just a moment it's going to look like it's moving counterclockwise. So just in case, and if you're still not detecting it, look at the nose. I feel like that can be helpful, is to look at the nose. All right. So, really, really interesting kind of effect that motion can have. And I wanted to bring this up because we talked about it very briefly in that first lecture when we were looking at the Ames window, if you remember that, where there was that window that was moving around, and it kind of looked like it was actually moving back and forth like this, right? And this is an example of that, but with face perception kind of sprinkled in with that mask illusion. So why does that happen? I guess I should probably go back and address that a little bit. That here, when we're seeing this face right here, this face looks kind of ambiguous, and we typically do not see shadows across people's faces like this in this way unless this nose is pointing at us, which is why at this point this nose looks like it is pointing in our direction. It looks like it is pointing closer to us, but we know that that's not true. And in fact, this point right here, the nose actually pointed further away than ever as that face is rotating around. And to me, it still looks like it's moving now counterclockwise. And then once we get the recognizable features, now it seems to be moving clockwise again. So one of the fascinating things about this is that people that have schizophrenia do not typically, or certain kinds of schizophrenia, I should specifically say, are not able to detect that Ames illusion, that rotating mask illusion. There's some explanations about why that might be that usually have to deal with their eye. People that have schizophrenia or certain symptoms of schizophrenia can have what's called, and we're going to talk about this later today, smooth tracking. Smooth tracking is how our eyes just very naturally can move around. And for people that have schizophrenia, one of the symptom clusters is that your eyes don't have smooth tracking, that it has many more saccades in it, where it kind of moves back and forth and jumps around, kind of like that, and that's kind of the explanation that most people have for why people with schizophrenia don't always perceive that mask illusion the same way that we do. That other folks that have schizophrenia might see that as moving clockwise the entire time. All right, so let's talk about apparent motion. So far, actually, in this video, every single thing you have seen is apparent motion. If you look away from the screen and you see anything else moving, that is not apparent motion. So everything that you're seeing on the computer or on your screen in front of you is an illusion, but it's one that we commonly have accepted in our society. It's just how we visually show things in quick succession, that we are going to show images fast enough that our perceptual system, our nervous system, mistakes it for being actual motion. So apparent motion is the perception of motion whenever we have a very quick alteration of images. And I don't know about you, if you were maybe a bored child like I was growing up in elementary school, one of the things that I really love to do is take like a stack of Post-it notes and draw like a little stick figure on one page and then move to the next page and draw that same stick figure, but now he's got his hand moving up a little bit, and then the next stick figure, the hand is up a little bit further now, and then the next page you have a stick figure and its hand is even further up. And then whenever you thumb through that little sketchbook that you made, it looks like that little stick figure is moving, right? And so if you've ever done that before, that is apparent motion. And you know that if you look at just one of those still frames at a time, it doesn't look like motion. It has to be at a specific speed, right? And so that threshold where we begin to perceive it as motion, that is now moves from static imagery to our perception of motion, which is apparent motion. And this is very different than how we typically see things in the world around us. But it kind of plays on the same ideas. It plays on the same kind of visual phenomenon that we would see if we saw if my dog got up and moved around, for example. So here's the flip book, and you can see that somebody drew what appears to be like this flower blossoming, right? So it starts out like this, and then each successive page is a little bit different, and then whenever you show it in quick succession, it changes before your very eyes. Here's a really cool sketchbook that somebody made, and this is as a GIF. And the reason why I like this, two reasons. Well, actually 3 reasons. One is because it's just very well done. It's just very pleasing to look at. So one reason is that this is an example of apparent motion, right? You can see that they are flipping through this flip book, and that there are lots and lots of pages here that give the impression of movement. They give us what looks like motion occurring. The other thing that I like about it is that it plays with our sense of depth, right? That just for a moment, it actually looks like that these pages have some depth. They don't look completely flat because they're using linear perspective, if you remember that from chapter 6. All right, so this brings us to a conversation about frames per second, and those of you that are, especially those of you that are gamers out there who like playing video games, especially PC games or consoles, you know probably that frames per second is a big deal, and that in those communities, people will argue over, if a game is at 60 frames per second or at 30 frames per second or whatever. Most movies, if you go to the theater or if you are watching something on TV, most movies are recorded and projected at 24 frames per second, which means that it's 24 still images that are presented all within the span of 1 second. So whenever you're watching SpongeBob, for example, that is, in most cases, about 24 frames, 24 images, 24 drawings presented in 1 second. And the reason why I said usually is because sometimes whenever people are trying to save money, these animation studios, they'll try to get by with like 15 frames per second. They'll just be creative about it. So anymore, if you go to the theater and you see something with more than 24 frames per second, it weirds people out. If you show it in less than 24 frames per second, it looks bad. So that speed needs to be sufficiently high enough to create that illusion for us. And this led to a really weird kind of scandal. It's almost long history by now, but I want to tell you this quick story about the director, Peter Jackson. Some of you, if you like movies, you may know Peter Jackson. He's kind of a big deal. New Zealander. He did a lot of really big movies in the 2000s, like the Lord of the Rings franchise, if you're familiar with that. He would go on to do the King Kong remake. He would go on to do a couple of, I don't know if you remember, there was like a Beatles documentary that came out that people were obsessed with on Disney Plus. What else did he do? And he did the Hobbit series. So he did the Hobbit series, which is a prequel to the Lord of the Rings. And so basically, he is a tech guy. He loves technology. He loves special effects. He's like George Lucas in that way. Peter Jackson put a lot of the money that he made doing Lord of the Rings into visual studios. He worked really closely with this company called Weta, W-E-T-A. And they would go on to do a lot of incredible CGI stuff. So, like, if you've seen any of the Planet of the Apes movies, the more recent ones, they look amazing, right? And it's because they use a lot of the technology that he helped kind of produce and sponsor. And they worked with him on Lord of the Rings. Anyways, he cares a lot about this stuff. And he had this crazy idea, which is that he was going to show movies at faster than 24 frames per second. So he was going to record those movies in faster than 24 frames per second and projected them faster than 24 frames per second so that movies would look more realistic, essentially. And so he compared this to how people used to be obsessed with vinyl records, and then digital CDs and MP3s and now streaming have overtaken those media, right? That people generally will listen to things on YouTube or whatever, which drives me crazy because audio quality is really not good on YouTube, but everybody thinks that it's fine because we just accept it now. And don't get me started. We'll talk more about it when we talk about music perception in chapter 11. But he basically was like, yeah, people kind of got over that with vinyl records whenever they realized like how CDs could basically do just as good as vinyl. People don't recognize the differences here. And so basically what he's saying is that he thinks that people are able to get a lifelike experience this. But the issue here is that whenever The Hobbit came out, whenever he projected it at 48 frames per second, people hated it, and they hated it a great deal. You can see all of these. I went through and found a bunch of these quotes that where people were talking trash about how The Hobbit looked when it was in theaters. Looks like a video game. It's pellucid pictures of indistinct creatures. Ooh, how cutting. A high-def LED screen. Looks like video game outtakes. What else do we got? Somebody talks about... looks like the Metropolitan Opera live, which I think is interesting. I thought somebody may have talked about soap opera, because when I saw it in theaters, I had the same kind of feeling of like, this kind of looks like a soap opera almost. Oh yeah, here we go. Mounted a live TV show on the world's largest home TV screen. And that is true. Interestingly, people are totally fine seeing sports whenever they are projected at this really fast frame rate. There's just something about things that are on TV, things that are produced that freak people out, where you feel like you can see now the special effects. You can see the makeup. You can see the artifice whenever it is projected that fast. And so that's why when we're watching live TV or we're watching sports, it's totally okay. We want to be in the moment. We want to see things as accurately as possible. Ong Lee, the Taiwanese director who made Gemini Man. I don't know if y'all even remember Gemini Man, but Ong Lee did Brokeback Mountain. He did Life of Pi. He's done a bunch of really Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. He's done a lot of great movies. He made Gemini Man and tried to do the same thing with high frame rate, and audiences were just not into it. People did not like it, so this is something that. We also had Avatar 2. All the underwater scenes in Avatar 2 were filmed at high frame rates, and people didn't like that either because they felt like it looked too much like a video game. So clearly this is weirding people out, and the reason why this is really fascinating to me is because video games, people like that at a higher frame rate than what they see in the movies or see on TV. And I don't exactly have a good explanation for why that is, about why whenever you're interacting with it, 60 frames per second is fine, but whenever you're sitting back and watching it in a theater or at home on your sofa, it looks weird. This demo, this interaction, I'm not going to show this too much on this screen because while you're watching it over YouTube, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. There's enough compression going on here that it's just not going to work. But I would encourage you to check it out because our discussion for this chapter is all about motion smoothing. And you can see what a motion blur is and why some people do and don't like motion smoothing. So, for example, let me pull out a nice forest setting right here. And then, you can't see this. Sorry, my bad. Whenever you check this out on your own time, you'll see what I mean. Where you can turn on and off the motion smoothing. This is going to be at 60 frames. Whoops, sorry. That was the environment. I'm going to take these two soccer balls. And you can see that they both have motion blur on, but one of them looks really kind of cartoony, right? So this soccer ball looks kind of cartoony compared to the one that's kind of blurry. The one that is cartoony is at 60 frames per second, though. So it's weird that even though that looks more like the real world, it looks faker than it would look like or our impression of what would look fake. In reality, if you threw a soccer ball, it would probably look as clear as what you see here. There's something about how we've gotten used to seeing blur from our recording devices, including your phones, that have just kind of, we've learned that motion blurs are common, or whatever. So check this out if you want to. You can change how fast they are moving. You can change whether or not it has a motion blur or not. I'm turning them both off now here. And now you can see how the 25 frames per second, it looks kind of jagged. The animation doesn't look nearly as smooth as the 60 frames per second, which is why gamers like the high frames per second versus down here where it just doesn't, it looks laggy, right? But again, I'm not going to walk through too much of this because on YouTube it may all look bad on YouTube. So check it out. Okay, let's talk about motion at a neural level. So whenever we are talking about seeing things move in our visual field, we are not just relying on one neuron that is active at any given time. It requires at least 2 neurons, and here's why. So imagine that you have this neuron right here, this photoreceptor. Let's say this is a cone. Even we can call this a cone, and so the cone is going to tell you, is there light or is there not light, and specifically, where is that light falling, right? So is that light on the periphery or is it in the center part? Because of the excitatory versus inhibitory part of the ganglion cells that are further downstream. You remember all this, right? So basically, we have a cell. This cell is going to tell us, is there something in front of it? Yes or no. And it's going to fire more quickly when there is. It's going to fire less quickly when there's not. All right. So we got this ladybug. This ladybug is in front of the cell, and now the cell is active. It's going to fire. It's going to say, "Yo, we got something here." But this one next to it is not. So this cell next to it is inhibitory. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, to keep it simple. So this cell is saying like, "Oh, there's something here." Now, by the time this ladybug moves over to this one, now this cell can say, all right, there's something in front of me. But if I did not have this cell here, if there was nothing here, then essentially this single cell is just telling us, yes, there's something presented in front of us, and now there's not. So that's very binary, right? It's just saying yes or no. And so based on that, we can't actually get any kind of indication of whether or not something is moving, which is why we need at least 2 cells. Because we have a neighboring cell now we can understand, and I'm using the word understand here very mentalistically, that there is a stimulus here, and now there's a stimulus here, and they're neighboring. So there was something here, and now there's something here, which gives us the impression of movement. There was something here, now there's something here. It's probably because it moved over, right? Because these 2 neighboring cells are now active. And then eventually now this one is going to become inhibitory, this one's excitatory, and then as that ladybug is moving, now this cell is going to be active, which tells us that, okay, now it has moved from all the way over here to this part. And now when this cell no longer has a trace of the ladybug, it's going to be inhibitory, and now this next one is going to be excitatory as it is moving across. You get the idea. And so basically, our sense of movement is going to be connected to this. It's connected to this notion that we require more than one cell or one neuron, one photoreceptor in order to detect vision, and that the more of these neighboring cells, the better, because it gives us a more clear idea of how fast something might be moving, or exactly where it's at. Okay, so this also gives a pretty good kind of look at, well, I was going to say, I think that it gives a cool indication of how motion perception works. So let me break this down and walk through it, because as soon as I saw it, I was like, wait a second, it's actually not that, this could be incomprehensible, right? Call your mom or dad into the room and be like, tell me what this means. And I don't think they'll be able to make heads or tails of it. So let's unpack it a little bit. So basically what we are looking at right here, think of each of these cells right here as a photoreceptor. And basically, Yeah, so just like what we were just looking at. So we got this this photoreceptor right here, and it's looking to see if it finds anything, and whenever it does, it's going to be active. Now within that, we are going to have cells that are connected to each of these, like what you see here. So we have, and oh man, I keep wanting to get ahead of myself, but I'm not going to let myself do that. So basically this cell is going to report back to this cell right here, and this cell right here is going to report back to this cell right here, because these neurons they communicate with one another, and eventually they're going to make their way over to the brain, right? Like we've talked about all semester long. So what we're seeing here is that if this cell is active and then this cell is active, then basically this cell right here is staying active while this one is active, while this one is active, and while this one is active. And so this can then communicate to this cell right here, yo, we got something in our field of view. There is something there. But that's not the only story, because we have neighboring cells connected to this. So let's say that this cell right here, these three are going to report to this cell. So now, whenever there is something in front of this cell is active, and as it moves over to this photoreceptor, it's also going to be active, and it's also going to report to this cell, which communicates further downstream. But as soon as that stimulus is out of the range of this cell, now it's not firing as much, right? So as it has left that, this one is not firing as much, but this one is still firing. And as it moves further over here, now this one is going to be lit up too, because it's got its eye kept out on these three. So this one is going to be active, and then ultimately this one's not going to be active, and it's going to report back to this. And basically what I'm saying here is that as we have these photoreceptors that are communicating with these ganglion cells, these ganglion cells are going to be communicating with these cells in the extrastriate cortex, that we have this hierarchy of movement, these neighboring cells communicating with each other. And you can see that this motion detector right here, now we have a cell that is specifically looking not just, is there activation, yes or no, or sorry, let me back up, is there something present in front of me, yes or no, but has there been movement? Has, in the way that would be integrated, the way that would be communicated to the next neuron downstream, is essentially, did we get activation from this cell, and then this cell? Or do we get activation from this cell, then this cell, then this cell? Because if we did, then that would be motion, right? Because it means that we found something in this part of our visual field, and then this part of our visual field, and then this part of our visual field. If we got activation from this, and this, so then this cell, which is detecting motion, can tell the rest of our brain, yo, we got something moving over here. Okay, that is really complicated, right? But ultimately what we're doing is we're just saying that we have a bunch of these little sensors. These little sensors are communicating with these bigger sensors, and those sensors are going to be communicating to these other bigger sensors. It works in this kind of hierarchical fashion. So when we're looking at motion at the small scale, which is what we're doing here, we're going to call that local motion. We're looking at the local cues. So like if you're looking at a ladybug to see if that ladybug's legs are moving, that'd be local motion. If you notice something fly across the room, that's global motion. So global motion would be like if you have some motion in this part of your visual field and then motion in this part of your visual field, then you have a broad change in motion, which this cell is going to communicate up, because this cell is connected to all these smaller local motion detectors. All right, so where is all this happening? Well, it really kind of starts back here in the striate cortex, and then in the extrastriate cortex as we are detecting light and things like that. But the global motion and where we're going to make sense of that is going to take place a little bit further downstream. Over in the MST, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So global motion and local motion, like I said, global motion is when we're looking at things that are moving very broadly, very quickly around us, they are going to be arranged and organized by the magnocellular layers of the lateral geniculate nucleus. You may remember that when we talked about it in Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Local motion is when we are looking at smaller things around us and to see if they are moving, and those are going to be organized by the parvocellular layers in our lateral geniculate nucleus. Those of you that are gamers, I always think, and so I don't know if this metaphor will work for you or this comparison, but I always think about the difference between these as being like, if you've ever played a first-person shooter, if you've ever played Fortnite or Call of Duty, or well, actually, Fortnite isn't first-person, is it? It's third-person? I don't know. I feel really old because I don't know something about Fortnite. Okay, Minecraft. All right, so Minecraft is first-person, right? So if you've ever been playing Minecraft and you're hanging out and you think you see something out the corner of your eye, and you stop for a second, now your eyes swivel over to that area, right? What happened is you noticed a global change in your environment, and now you're looking for that smaller change. The reason why I was thinking about Call of Duty is because I always think about this, like if I'm playing as a sniper or something, sometimes I'll not move and I'll just look at the screen, and then you'll see something activate a global motion detector, and then you whip over and you kind of like look, and now you're like zooming in. That's a change from global motion now to local motion cues. Now you're looking for these local motion cues to see if you find a rival opponent to murk or frag or whatever the word is that people use to talk about killing each other online. All right, this isn't getting dark. Let's move. Let's change subjects. So the medial temporal area, which is you can find here, is where we're going to see a lot of that grouping occur. So how do we know that these areas in further downstream are used for processing motion? Same way that we know that the inferotemporal cortex is responsible for recognizing objects. We know what happens whenever people damage that area because of lesion studies. We see what happens to their to the perceptions after they lose the ability to or after this area of the brain is damaged. So this is called a kinetopsia. So kinetopsia is in the medial temporal lobe, and it's another example of a double dissociation, because in this example, and I even hinted at this in Chapter 4 when we talked about the what versus where pathways. So a kinetopsia is if you didn't know where something is, and that's ultimately what motion blindness is. Motion blindness is also known as a kinetopsia, and I'll show you in just a second what it might be like to have a kinetopsia. So you may ask, well, how is it possible to know what something is but not know where something is? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine, like if I asked you, like, what is this? And then I asked you, where is it? And then you said, I don't know, right? That's kind of weird to think about. Let me show you how that would work. All right, so let me close this out. Oh, I got to talk about this too. All right, here we go. Okay, so for just a moment there, we were walking down the street. Let me rewind a little bit, and I'll let it play without the dramatic music. That basically what's happening is that our brain is updating the visual image in front of us, but not nearly as quickly as we do, or I say we, as folks that don't have a kinetopsia do, right? So here, if you're walking down the street, you can see how disorienting that is. It's hard to know exactly where people are in real time. You have a snapshot of where they were, but you don't know where they are. You don't know their location because you can't really detect the motion in front of you. So this is an example of a kinetopsia. If you want to see another quick example of that, here's an example of being next to a highway.
Light them up. There's R31.
Mazda.
So that was regular, hanging out, noticing cars drive by. This is what it would be like if you had a kinetopsia. All right, so kind of unsettling, right? Where it's like the car just snuck up on you, right? You could hear it changing, so you can hear the motion, but you don't actually see it. It just almost looks like if you took one of those flip books and you just moved it page by, you just kind of like moved it like in 20-page increments, every second, instead of flipping it through naturally. Here's an example of like trying to pour something. It says coffee, but I don't know. Let me know, chat. It doesn't look like coffee to me. It looks like maybe grapefruit juice or something. You can see what it would be like to try to pour coffee. Here is without a kinetopsia. Oh, sorry, this is with a kinetopsia, my bad. All right. And you can see how it just spilled all over, right? And so whenever you're filling this up, nice comment here, real life, low FPS. That's not coffee. I'm going to give that a thumbs up. Thank you for that. But okay, so basically both of those were examples of a kinetopsia, where you can know what it is that you're looking at, but you don't know where it reliably is because you don't have the impression of motion. We talked about motion after effects, and just to kind of talk a little bit about motion after effects, this is very similar to color after images. If you remember with color after images, essentially what happened is we would look at a color, we'd stare at it, we look at it for so long that the areas of our brain that are processing this, that are communicating that we are seeing color, they start to get a little bit bored, and they're like, this is no longer a change. And if you remember, in almost every single chapter I mentioned that our perceptual system is really just a glorified change detector. That what our senses do really well is detect change, which is why, like when things pop out in a screen in front of you, we notice it. If it suddenly appears, we're really good at detecting change. Maybe not as good if somebody slowly turned up the white noise outside your room. You might not notice it immediately, right? But if somebody turned it on, at high volume to begin with, you would notice it immediately. We're really good at detecting change. So whenever we are looking at color, if we're looking at it for long enough, we adapt to it. And when we adapt to it, that cell that was firing very frequently is no longer firing as fast. It's going to ultimately adjust to baseline while you're looking at that stimulus. So when you remove that stimulus, let me draw this out actually, where we have, why did I not think about this to begin with? I'm gonna write this out. So I'm gonna say we got like a stimulus onset right here. So I'm going to be making a tick for action potentials occurring. So once that stimulus is there, we move from this baseline kind of activation to now it's really, really fast. We're getting a lot of this. But as it goes on, that cell is like, okay, this isn't really a change. And what happens is it starts firing roughly back to baseline. So what happens now whenever you get rid of this? So if you're still looking, and let's say that in this case we're looking at the color yellow. Now we're going to do the same thing where we've been looking at yellow this entire time. So if we have been looking at yellow, we've adapted to it, and now we get rid of it. So this is going to be the stimulus offset right here. That what happens is that now, as like a reaction to this, we do notice a change, right? And so this cell is like, wait a second, there is a change, and we are going to register that as the inverse of what we were just experiencing. So if we're looking at yellow and it goes away, now we detect what feels like a change, and now you can see that these action potentials have slowed down big time, because by comparison, if we have gotten used to yellow as baseline, now the absence of yellow feels like a change, and we are going to register this, as you may remember from chapter 3, as blue, right? We can do this exact same kind of exercise, but let's say instead of thinking about this in terms of color, let's say that this is that we're detecting things as forward. And so at first we're stationary, and then in the bottom one we've been moving for a while. Same thing. So basically what I'm showing here is that we're stationary, so what we're seeing. Once we start moving, we're in a car, let's say, we detect that we're moving. So you can feel internally that you're moving. Let's set that aside. Let's talk about just visually. You can detect that you're moving immediately, right? So visually you know that you're moving. But as you keep moving, let's say that you're on the Mass Pike and you're in a really lonely stretch where it's just trees the entire way. If you've been moving long enough, now you're not really, it doesn't really feel like you're moving. This is now the new normal, right? This is now your baseline. That this cell is not going to keep firing as fast as it was. It's conserving energy now. But if you were to slam on brakes and stop, again, let's divorce that from the actual physical sensation of moving. But visually, now you're not moving. You're going to feel this really, really weird kind of after effect where it feels now like you're going in reverse almost. And that's because now that there is a change, we are detecting that change and it's in the reverse. So we detect it, and now this cell is inhibiting. It's moving less than it was before whenever you were stationary, because by comparison, something has changed. So I hope that makes sense. I did my best. I know it's confusing, and the book tries to outline it. I think I do a better No, I'm not going to say I do a better job in the book. It's just that I spend more time than the book does. The thing that I want to mention here is a quick anecdote that you may relate to for motion after effects, because some of you may be like, well, when are you ever going to experience that? And that's a fair question. Maybe, I feel like usually driving is where you might feel this, or if you're riding shotgun especially. If you're watching movies, playing games, you can experience this. I first experienced this whenever I played Guitar Hero. You may remember Guitar Hero, this game probably before some of your time, where you're looking at, actually let me pull it up, because some of you do not know what I'm talking about. So here's a quick example. All right, so basically you're looking at this thing and you can see, oh, this is really bad resolution, huh? It's this standard def. Basically, you're looking at this fretboard as these things are coming down. Same thing with Dance Dance Revolution, if you've ever played that, where you have these stimuli that are moving in a single direction the entire time. Everything is moving downwards. That this fretboard is moving downwards constantly, And I played this game so much in college. Like I played it. I play video games and I'm a musician, so it was like right up my alley. I loved it. Played it all the time, and there was one time where I played for like several hours, and then when I stopped, I looked over at my bedroom wall, and my bedroom wall started crawling up. Like the poster on my wall, it looked like it was melting forward, upwards, into the ceiling, and it was an extremely what's the word? Discomforted? Distressed. It was very distressing because I was freaking out. I was like, oh my god, it finally happened. I ruined my eyes from playing video games too much, just like my parents said would happen. But no, after a few minutes it went away, because what happened is I was experiencing the motion after effect. I had this impression that this moving downward like this was now the status quo, that this was baseline. So whenever I took that stimulus away, Now, regular flat stationary stimuli appeared to be moving in the opposite direction because I was experiencing that inhibitory response from those cells. All right, let's get back into it. I lost my place. We were talking about after effects, and we just did that. So let's now talk about the other types of motion. There are a few different types of motion beyond apparent motion, that we had talked about, and these are usually, again, defined by the change in their environment, so the change of what's around them. So I wanted to go through in the video and show you these instead of relying on you to do this on your own, because these are so important. So this one, when I do this full screen, I'm worried that it's cutting off on your end, so I'm going to try it like this. Basically what you're looking at here is you are looking at two stimuli. One is moving and one is not actually moving. So the one on the right, and what I want you to do is actually just focus right here on my cursor for a second. If you're focusing on my cursor, if you're focusing on that yellow thing, you can tell that actually both of them kind of look like they're moving, right? The one on the right is clearly moving. It's moving closer and further away from this. But if you look at the stimulus on the left, the stimulus on the left has, now if I'm looking directly at it, it kind of ruins the illusion, but that is first order motion. And first order motion is whenever the change of luminance in a light gives the impression that it is moving. So that is a form of motion detection. And the reason I was instructing you to look at that cursor right now is because I feel like it works better when it's in your periphery, especially like if you're now looking further over here and you're trying to, out of the corner of your eye, look at that yellow. Now it looks more like it's moving because you have fewer photoreceptors over there, so you're more likely to catch that illusion. Whereas if you're looking at it with your fovea, you have high def vision because the high spatial acuity, and it's a little bit easier to tell that it's not actually moving. The second that we have is, this is second order motion. And second order motion is where you notice movement because of the contrast with its surroundings. So what are we looking at right here? What you just saw, right? You just saw that rectangle is moving, right? How do you know it's a rectangle? Well, because as it's moving, we have this entire group moving all at once in unison, and so we recognize that as being an object, and that object being a square because of that consistent movement. That's second order movement. All right, so first order is all about changes in luminance. Second order is about changes in texture, I guess you can say. Another kind of movement is called optic flow, and optic flow is whenever you're moving forward in space. And whenever you're moving forward in space, it gives us the impression of moving. Let me see if I can pull up a video of this. 1 second. All right. Oh, I just paused it. Okay, there we go. So this right here. Okay, cool. So if you've seen this before, this is an example of optic flow. I don't know why every like Windows 95, Windows 98 computer had this as like the default or something like this. And so what are we looking at here? It gives us the impression that we are moving through space, right? And you've probably seen this on any kind of sci-fi show. You've seen it on Star Wars or whatever. Whenever somebody's traveling really fast through space, it looks like this. Why do we know that that's what that is? Because it looks like things are flying behind us, right? It looks like we are moving forward because light is moving in specific directions, and specifically it looks like we are moving right here in the center because all light that is not in that center is either, if it's just above it, it's going to move this direction. If it's to the left, it's going to move this direction. If it's to the right, it's going to move this direction. If it starts below this, it's going to move in that direction. And it gives us the impression that we are moving forward. As you can see, this video is called Flying Through Stars, Warp Speed, Space, Universe, Spaceship, 8-hour screensaver. Does it have any good music? Nope, unfortunately not. Okay, so that is optic flow. And that's something that we can use as a cue to know what direction we are moving. Obviously, we could do this in reverse, and we would know that we're moving to behind us. But this tells us about movement. It tells us that from our perspective that maybe things aren't moving around us, but that we are moving in a specific direction. And people have used this to look at, like, can you measure distance just by looking at optic flow? And it turns out that you can. Here is another form of biological appropriate movement. So if I were to ask you what this is, it looks like a person, right? A person kind of with their head down, but it looks like they're walking. Even though this is only like 12 different dots, we recognize this as a human. So because it is biologically relevant, because it looks like a person, it is very easily detectable by us. If you were to show this to let's say I was going to say monkey, but I don't know if that's a good example. If you were to show this to a pigeon, for example, and I'm using pigeons because that's what I studied in grad school. If you are showing this to a pigeon and trying to have them classify images as humans versus, I don't know, any random type of movement of these circles, they won't be able to do it. If you give it to a person, they can. If you give a pigeon essentially what is 12 dots that look like a pigeon moving versus random movement, they will also be able to categorize that as pigeon movements. Like, they can categorize that as not just arbitrary, not just random movement. And this has been studied with monkeys, it's been studied with mice, I think it's been studied with dogs too, and that suggests that it's not species specific. It's not just us being able to look at this and determine that it is supposed to be a person. All right, eye movements. I mentioned this already a little bit before when we were talking about the rubber mask illusion, but smooth pursuit is like if you were following my cursor, if your eye is able to very naturally just kind of follow it in a single motion, and that is an example of smooth pursuit. But that's not how all of our eyes work. Imagine if you are looking, like, look down at your computer, look back up at your, okay, so here's what I want you to do. If you're at a computer, let's say, I want you to look at the screen and then look at the keyboard and then look at the top of the screen and then look at the far right of the screen. So we got 4 pieces here. So you're going to start screen, then move down to keyboard, look at the top of the screen, then look over to the right hand side of the screen. If you're doing that, that's an example of a saccade. So like I'm doing it right now, so let's do 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so here we go. 1, screen, 2, keyboard, 3, top of screen, 4, far right. Your eye moving like that is a saccade. It is a very rapid change in where you are fixating from multiple points around you. If you looked at your screen and then when I said look at your keyboard, your eyes did this, where you look down and then I asked you to look up at the top of the screen, and your eyes moved up like that, and that would be an example of using smooth pursuit. Most people don't do it that way, right? They'll look here and they'll immediately look down, and they'll immediately look back up, and they'll immediately look over here. All right, and I already talked about the connection with schizophrenia here. You can see the eye muscles that are connected to the eye that power a lot of this, as we are going to see in chapter 12 when we talk about the vestibular system and when we talk about our sense of balance. The muscles that control the eyes are connected to regions of the brain responsible for perceiving motions in many fewer neurons than you might expect. Usually, there's like really complicated networks that are all communicating with each other. There's a pretty direct line for your eye muscles, which explains part of how we are able to react so quickly, reflexively, to motion when we see it around us. Is there anything here that I want to mention? Not necessarily. This just illustrates what I was talking about how we have some networks that just move from the lateral geniculate nucleus. And again, we're talking about if it's global motion, then that's going to be the magnocellular layers, or if it's local motion, that's parvocellular. That's going to go to the V1. From there, that information is going to be communicated up this way. You may remember that as the Ware pathway. But we also have some of that information is going to go over to the frontal eye field, which is going to communicate with the superior colliculus, which is going to control your muscles of your eye. This is notable because the superior colliculus is down here in this midbrain area. These, sometimes people call them deep brain structures, that are more primitive and reflexive in their actions than a lot of our other areas. The final thing that I want to mention for this chapter are the different interactions that we have with vision. So check out this video if you want a quick look at synesthesia, for example. In the upcoming chapters, we're going to be talking about how vision is going to interact with hearing when we are talking about speech perception. It interacts with balance and our sense of angles and orientation when we talk about car sickness and seasickness. We can use information about vision to help us understand the texture of things that we touch. And we can also use vision to determine whether or not something is edible, or if something is going to taste a certain way. You see this all the time, and you see this all the time when we talk about like fine dining and like these like really artsy, really extremely expensive areas to eat, that they'll have like something that looks like ice cream but tastes like meat or whatever. And the reason why that's fun is because we have some pretty consistent connections with vision and taste. We know if something's going to taste healthy. We know if something's going to taste fatty. We know if something's going to taste sweet, for example. But I want to spend the remaining time here talking about synesthesia, because our research article 2 is about synesthesia. So you'll have a quiz on that. So synesthesia is whenever you have one sense that is going to lead to an involuntary reaction from a secondary. Hold on. I phrased that in a way that I don't feel good about. I was trying to go off script here. I didn't want to read it word for word because I feel like that's kind of boring sometimes. So let me see if I can think of it a slightly different way. Synesthesia is whenever one part of your brain that is perceiving one consistent stimulus is also going to activate an area of your brain that is usually perceptually different from the first. So this would be like if you smell something and you feel like you can see that smell. Very uncommon, but it exists. Or if somebody says the number 4 and you feel a very specific texture of that 4, and it's qualitatively different than a 5, and that's very different than a 6, that you feel something about those numbers. The most common version of this is color grapheme synesthesia, and this is, I want to say, about anywhere between 2 to 5% of the population might have color grapheme synesthesia. This is where you see a number or a letter, and it is I was going to say associated with a specific color. I don't know if I want to say associated, because that almost sounds like you learned it. It almost sounds like through classical conditioning you learned it, but that's not really what I mean here. You can do that. You can associate numbers with unrelated stimuli if you want to, but I mean that this is like a reflexive thing that you don't really have control over. Where if you look at the number 2 and you see it as green, you look at the number 3 and you see that as pink, you look at the number 4 and you see that as red, or you see the word stimulation, and that has like a mix of colors because each of these letters have their own color, and so it stands out to you in that way. So that's color grapheme synesthesia, and it's not like an association like you've learned it, but this is like ever since growing up you've had this. For a lot of folks is how it works. And that's why it's interesting, because in college and in high school, that's really where people start realizing that they have color grapheme synesthesia. A lot of people who have synesthesia, they don't really recognize they have synesthesia until their teenage years, where they start really realizing what we all kind of experience, and realizing like, oh, people don't see, whenever they see the number 3, they don't see it in red ink naturally. Trying to think of, I have a quick test for you that I think I'll show that to you first. Let me show you this. So I'm going to ask you to count the number of 2s here. So take a quick second and see if you can count the number of 2s you see on the screen. Okay, so if it took you more than 2 seconds, you probably don't have color grapheme synesthesia. I'm sorry to say. When I look at this, it's just 5s and 2s, and they're all in black and white. And I was able to look at it and be like, all right, there's a 2 here, a 2 here, a 2 here, 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 and here, right? So there's 6 of them. But if you had color grapheme synesthesia, you might see something a little bit more like this, where it pops out at you immediately. So you'll note all of these 5s are the same color. All of these 2s are the same color, which is how synesthesia works. That generally speaking, that it's a very consistent, very reliable color or texture or whatever the combination is that you perceive. And it's automatic, it's unconscious. You don't have to think about it. It just pops out at you as easy as what you see right here on the right. Another example of this that we're going to talk about is auditory tactile synesthesia, which is where sounds might elicit specific sensations across your body, and people suspect that ASMR. This video I'm uploading on YouTube, so I assume you probably know what ASMR is, but it's the autonomic sensory, what do you think the M is? Meridian. Nobody expected that response. And ASMR, basically, if you have never heard of that before, never seen a video on YouTube of people doing this, usually it involves very quiet, very soft stimuli, and that results in a tactile sensation that a lot of people will say it feels like tingles. And that those tingles can run from the top of your scalp down your back or whatever. And it's a little bit different for everybody. Like when we're talking about color grapheme synesthesia, if I had it, I might not see these 5s as green. Maybe for me, I see them as blue. Or maybe I see them as polka dot or something like that. So they don't have to be the same for everybody, but they are consistent. That if I was 12 and I'm 12 years old and these were polka dot then, they're going to be polka dot when I'm 22 as well. So they remain consistent. This all happens without any kind of conscious awareness. And if you're wondering why color grapheme synesthesia is the most common version of that, it has to do with how synesthesia manifests in its brain, which is ultimately, and I'm going to show you this in a slide coming up. You got your brain right here. You got the area of your brain responsible for color perception and responsible for morphology or grapheme recognition next to it, and so whenever this area is active for color perception, is right next to this other one. If you had a couple of neurons that were connecting these two, you might be able to stimulate one area, resulting in a stimulation of the secondary area, which is what happens. And we call this neural crosstalk. Let me write that out. And yes, I know I write my S's upside down whenever I'm doing it. I don't want to hear about it. But that's called neural crosstalk, where basically you have the connections between these two areas that are, for most people, not communicating with one another. But for people that have synesthesia, they are communicating. So a weird example of this would be like this one guy who said that he hated driving because looking at road signs to him tasted like earwax and ice cream. So whenever he's looking at that, and so for him, those areas are probably like, let's see, we got road signs, and it's hard to know exactly for him where that is. I'm going to say that's the inferotemporal cortex, maybe. And then he's got the insula, which is going to be for taste. You can see that those are not that far away from one another, right? Where stimulating one would result in a stimulation of the other. In this case, stimulating the inferotemporal cortex is stimulating the taste areas. But yeah, that's ultimately what most people kind of have shown synesthesia to be, is these kind of areas that communicate with each other, when for most of the population they don't do that. I already mentioned ASMR. There's lots and lots of videos of this if you want to check it out, but we don't know that much about it, partly because there's very, very little peer-reviewed research about this, and I mean relative to other areas. But even still, ASMR, I feel like, has been in the public consciousness for at least 10 years now. It's been 10 years since I heard about it, and yet it's hard to study, because we're talking about these kind of private, internal kind of perceptions. So how do I know, how can I quantify my experience and compare it with somebody else's? That's the whole tricky area with all of perceptual research, right? But because it's a very large online community, but if you were to ask somebody in the classroom, like, hey, do you have ASMR? Most people either don't know, or they call it something else, or somewhere in between. And so there's just not a whole lot of research on this, but it's coming along. People are putting it in the MRI scanner and figuring it out, where the stuff is coming from. I wanted to at least introduce research article number 2, which is by Whitaker and colleagues. White matter microstructure throughout the brain correlates with visual imagery and grapheme color synesthesia. So basically what they have here is people giving their visual imagery when they have color grapheme synesthesia, and then looking at the white matter structure, so the some of the connections of neurons and the networks that connect these areas throughout the brain. So what we are looking at right here is people who are synesthetes and people who are not synesthetes. So people who have color grapheme synesthesia versus people who are not. And then right here we have this was a inventory that they gave them, and you can see already that there is a group difference between asking people about the vividness of their visual imagery for synesthetes versus controls. People that have synesthesia, probably not surprisingly, have more vivid visual imagery than people who are not synesthetes. And then that kind of maps onto these really interesting changes throughout the brain. Here, fractional anastropy, this is a measurement of white matter, or specifically kind of like the ability for molecules to pass through certain parts of your brain. So the higher the, well, hold on, let me think if I have this right. I was thinking that it was the higher the value here, the more dense it is, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Either way, so double check the language whenever you're looking at the figure caption for figure 1B whenever you get a chance. But basically here what they're looking at is that for the controls, that this doesn't actually change depending on how vivid their visual imagery is. So if I have a really vivid visual imagination and you don't, and neither of us have synesthesia, that doesn't result in differences in the white matter structure of our brain. However, if we have synesthesia, it does, which basically leads us to believe that it could be something about how dense the white matter structure is throughout the brain that lends that vividness to people that have synesthesia. So what is it about synesthesia that allows people to have these really vivid kind of, and I should specify color grapheme synesthesia, these really kind of vivid perceptual experiences? It might have something to do with the density of the white matter spread throughout our brain. So that's the the take-home message of this article, but you'll get a chance to kind of look at it and think about it yourself. Okay, thank you so much for watching. Next chapter, we are moving into hearing. We are done with vision, which is very exciting. Now, before we go, some of you have already clicked out. That's okay. I wanted to go over this ballerina illusion, so I'm going to mute this for a second. This is a really fun illusion because so just stop what you're doing and tell me, is this moving clockwise or counterclockwise? And actually, if you email me at tdaniel@westfield before exam number 2, so but before that's due, if you tell me, is she moving clockwise or counterclockwise? So just email it. You don't even have to say hello. Just email counterclockwise or clockwise. If you do that, I'll give you extra credit. I'll give you 2 points extra credit for sticking with me. So what do you see? Some of you are going to see clockwise, some of you are going to see counterclockwise. Let me reset it. Now, the interesting thing is that there is going to be disagreement. That's okay, because this is it's an ambiguous stimulus, so maybe we don't know, right? But the fun thing about this is that it can change. That some of you are going to perceive this as clockwise and then counterclockwise, and then it might swap. And if you want it to swap, instead of just trying to will your mind to do it, I would suggest either looking at this hand right here, this secondary hand that's down, and if you look at that and then try to imagine that hand moving in the other direction, that can help. Or if you do the same thing with this foot down here, that can help too. If you're still not getting it though, if you're still not able to toggle back and forth, that's okay. Maybe leave the room and come back, and you might actually, that did it for me. Just looking away and then looking back, it looks different. But I thought that this video does a pretty good job of showing how this might work. So in this ballerina, we're looking over here at this ambiguous image, right? So this silhouette, I can't tell. Some of you are seeing this as counterclockwise, some of you are seeing this as regular clockwise. I am seeing it as counterclockwise. So I am seeing it very much like this right here, this figure right here. But now they all look like they're doing the same thing, right? Very, very different. But much like the rubber mask illusion, depending on where your eyes are moving, we will either check it as a continuous fluid motion, or we might think of it as going now in the opposite direction entirely. All right, so thank you so much for watching, and email me for your extra credit, and I will see you later. Bye, everybody.